Hello, everyone. Okay, our speaker today, we are very pleased to welcome Laura Humphreys. Laura is currently a collections information project manager at the Science Museum Group, and she's speaking to us at their site today near Swindon. I think that's right. Laura has a PhD from a collaborative PhD between Queen Mary and the Museum of the Home, where she worked on Victorian and Edwardian domestic labour, which was the subject of her book, Globalising Housework, which came out with Routledge last year. And there's also a link for that in the chat, so go and have a look. She's going to be talking to us today about celebrity chefs, ice cream makers, and white supremacy. And so without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Laura.
Thank you very much, Charlie. And just thank you as well to the IHR Food History Seminar for hosting me. Let me just get my screen share sorted. Can you just let me know if you can see that?
Yeah, it's working. Great.
Wonderful. Okay. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about global foods in English homes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with a focus on London. So shameless plug, this is based on research from my book, Globalising Housework, where I go into quite a bit more detail about a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. It was, as I'm sure you've all experienced, very painful to cut out all the little case studies that I'm very passionate about. Domestic labour is something that we all do every day, no matter the shape or composition of our homes and houses. And although it's often overlooked, I think it can tell us a lot about who we are and the world that we live in. Cooking, serving, and eating food is an absolutely fundamental part of domestic labour. And I'm going to take you through how some global influences found their way into private homes in London during this time period and what they can tell us about changing tastes, identity, and culture in the Victorian and Edwardian world. So when I was writing this paper, I was thinking about taking you through a chronology of when different foods arrived in private homes and the rise and fall of various food fashions. But as I was going through it, I realized that actually the most interesting thing about this is how these foods come in and out of people's houses, and then what they can tell us about what was going on in the world outside that they were coming in from, as well as the inside. But before I get started on that, I have to put this into some context. So I think we need to talk about English food first and about what people actually think of English food. So this man here is Matthew Barton. He was appointed in the Obama administration as the United States ambassador to the United Kingdom, and he served from 2013 to 17, largely with distinction. He was awarded medals on both sides of the Atlantic for his service here. However, he did cause one fairly major diplomatic incident. In an interview with Tatler magazine, of all places, he was asked what he would serve at his ideal dinner party. And his answer after less than a year in the UK was this. I'll tell you what I would not serve: lamb and potatoes. I must have had lamb and potatoes 180 times since I have been here. There are limits and I have reached them. So in response, The Guardian called for Barton to be pelted with potatoes as he resigned in disgrace and left the UK, as he now surely must. Now, I'm fairly sure it was in jest, because later in the same article, The Guardian did say we should be very proud that British food has the texture and taste of damp gravel. But the UK did take his comments very personally, and it took up a lot of column inches in the British press, perhaps because it struck a nerve. Barton is far from the first person to criticise the meat and potatoes monotony of the British diet. So this is another American, Elizabeth Banks. She was an investigative journalist who in the 1890s went undercover in a variety of roles in London, including as a maid, a laundress, a wealthy heiress, and a Covent Garden flower girl. Banks published her works in 1894 in a book called Campaigns of Curiosity, and much of her work highlighted the plight of the working classes in London and shone a light on some of the terrible living and working conditions that many of them were enduring. She also made observations about British food and cooking, and this quotation is from when she went undercover as a maid in a London house. Mary was what is commonly called a plain cook, not a professed one, as she confidently informed me. And when I noticed her way of preparing potatoes, I decided that she was a very plain cook indeed. Now, it's not only the Americans either who take issue with English food and cooking. the social commentator and author Behramji Malabari from India made a study of English domestic life and was a prominent critic of British eating and drinking habits. He said, "In no respect, perhaps, does the average Englishman show himself to be so slow of imagination and wanting in taste as with respect to his daily food. He eats what his fathers ate before him, bread and ham or cheese, an egg by way of variety with black tea or coffee. His lunch may be a mere apology." Malabari went on to argue that binge drinking habits and widespread alcoholism in England was largely driven by the heaviness and the indigestibility of English food. Perhaps most revealingly, though, the English were very self-critical of their food too. And I've chosen a particularly famous example here. Charles Dickens not only wrote a great deal of famous novels, but he also published a domestic magazine called Household Words, and his quotations from there in 1850. "What is commonly self-called a plain cook is a cook who spoils food for low wages. She is a cook not because she knows anything about cookery, but because she prefers the kitchen fire to scrubbing floors, polishing grates, or making beds. A cook who can boil a potato and dress a mutton chop is 1 in 1,000. So Matthew Barton is not alone. We are now well over a century into everybody complaining about boring lamb and overboiled potatoes in English homes, even Charles Dickens. But there is something important in what Dickens is saying here. He lays the blame squarely at the feet of the working class plain cook, and to a lesser extent, so does Elizabeth Banks. But elsewhere, Banks was quick to criticise Mary, the plain cook's employer, as the root of the problem, not Mary herself. Malabari, Banks, and other foreign writers actually rarely find fault with English servants. Quite the opposite. In fact, they're highly complimentary about English domestic workers being some of the best in the world. But English commentators are much keener to blame the staff. Here's another very typical example of criticism by an English author, this time by Mistress Congreve in the One-Made Book of Cookery. "In this country, there are some born cooks, but they are few and far between. It's probable that the overloading of the brain with book learning knocks out much of what we call common sense." So complaining about servants is even older than complaining about English food, and it goes at least back to Shakespeare. But in the 19th century, there was a new problem emerging in London. You can't really consider any middle-class domestic issues without understanding it. There was a serious developing shortage of domestic servants. In 1851, about 10% of the population of London worked in service, but by 1911, that was less than 4%. The actual numbers stayed quite stable for people working in service, around 250,000, but the population of London exploded in that same period from 2.2 million in 1851 to over 7 million in 1911. And by 1921, following the First World War and therefore dramatically increased employment options for women, and over 90% of servants were women at any given point in this period, this dropped dramatically again. And then in 1921, less than 0.3% of the London population worked in service. Being able to criticise cooks and domestic servants more widely for being overeducated, overambitious, or simply not knowing their place, domestic commentators were able to lay the blame for a national domestic failing at the feet of the working classes, rather than reflect on their own contribution to the embarrassing reputation of English food or to the flight of working women from private kitchens. But no matter the cause, domestic writers have been in agreement for some time. Help is needed in the English kitchen. So I want to take you through a few case studies of foods that were popular during the late 19th and early 20th century, how they became popular and what they can tell us. And the first case study I want to talk about is French food. As well as playing out class anxieties between the middle and the working classes in the kitchen, as with the servant problem, there's also an important interplay between the middle and the upper classes here. And this is particularly evident in the middle of the 19th century when French cuisine was at the height of its popularity, and it gave way to the first generation of what we might call celebrity chefs. Food can be used to express aspirations and ambition as much as fashion or housing can. And this was definitely true of French food in the 19th century. Haute cuisine, or high cooking, the formal style of dining that was developed in France in the 18th century, spread across Europe throughout the 19th. And by the 1850s, haute cuisine was firmly established as the dining style of choice for the English upper classes and even royalty. Queen Victoria famously had a succession of French and French-trained head chefs. And one of these chefs was Charles Francatelli here on the left. one in a line of Francophone chefs who trained in France and then led the royal kitchens of Buckingham Palace. Francatelli actually left royal service to take over the kitchens of the Reform Club, a gentleman's club, and he took over here from Alexis Soyer in the middle, who had, after a considerable career in the private kitchens of English aristocrats, designed the kitchens of the Reform Club to his own specification, and he was credited in part with bringing haute cuisine into the public realm in Britain. Another chef who followed this path was Georges-Auguste Escoffier. Escoffier was head chef at the Savoy Hotel, and then he moved on later to the Ritz-Carlton. All of these men traded off their status as chefs to the rich and famous, publishing books which sold in their thousands to middle-class householders who were keen to imitate the French foods which graced the tables of aristocracy and royalty. In the mid-19th century, at the height of the fashion for French cooking, French cookbooks for English audiences dominated a newly emerging publishing market for cookbooks and domestic manuals. This seems quite obvious to us today that famous chefs would publish books, but these were some of the first people to start doing this and trade on their reputation to sell books. Now, we can't take the publication of a book as a measure of its popularity or that it was ever used. I would just ask you all to think, how many cookbooks do you have at home that you've never opened or maybe never made a recipe from? So to investigate how popular these and some other cookbooks were, I looked at how many were printed and over how long a period to give an idea of demand. And from looking at this data, it's clear that French cookery really was a dominant force. Between 1850 and 1914, 7 of the top 10 foreign cookbooks published in England were French or French inspired. And in fact, Escoffier's Guide to Modern Cookery here was the second most popular in the period, running to at least 20 editions. Furthermore, increasingly non-French cookbooks took it as read that French was the language of the kitchen. Eliza Acton's seminal 1856 book, Modern Cookery for Private Families, was one of many English tomes which included a French kitchen vocabulary to assist the amateur chef de cuisine. Chefs like Francatelli, Soyer, and Escoffier translated their works into scaled-down instructional books for private households. And through these books, French methods, recipes, and language became a staple in the middle-class kitchens of London, accessible beyond the private homes of the rich and famous or the exclusive dining rooms of the gentlemen's clubs and five-star hotels in the city centre. Haute cuisine gave way to cuisine bourgeois. However, as the century progressed, although French cooking never disappeared entirely, its influence was certainly diluted as new foreign foods, methods, technologies, and recipes opened up a huge amount of choice for London households. The next case study I'd like to look at is the Italian contribution to 19th century food. In particular, I'd like to look at ice cream. So ice cream was first known in England during the reign of Charles II, though it took another 200 years for it to become widely known or available due to a lack of refrigeration technology. It was a very, very expensive and difficult business before refrigeration technology was developed. So this began to change in the city of London and then increasingly spreading throughout the UK through Italian penny icemen, or they were often known as hokey pokey men or the hokey pokey carts. And that possibly comes from the Italian phrase, oh che poco, or oh, how cheap. So the penny icemen of London sold penny licks and ice cream around the city from portable carts like this one on the left, which is in Greenwich. And by the late 19th century, there were over 300 Italian icemen selling sweets and sweet ices in Holborn alone, a district of London which earned the nickname Little Italy. And there were also 133 Italian families working in the confectionery trade, including providing ice creams to private homes. A driver behind the transformation of ice cream from a rare luxury to an affordable street food is the development of ice storage. And in particular in London, the Swiss-Italian Carlo Gatti's warehouses at King's Cross, which is now the London Canal Museum. You can actually go and visit it. And this is one on the right of Gatti's delivery trucks moving around the city. Locally harvested and imported ice could be stored and sold on in smaller portions throughout the city out of warehouses like Gatti's. And it really fueled the ice cream carts going out into the city. But the Italian contribution to ice technology certainly did not stop here. This is one of my favorite objects in the Science Museum collections. It's a prototype ice cream maker from around 1880, possibly a little bit earlier. It was donated to the museum by Estella Canziani. Her father was an engineer, and he developed this particular model at home. It looks huge in the photos, but to give you an idea of the amount of work involved in producing ice cream still, after several hours of churning, you would produce about a Ben & Jerry's tub's worth of ice cream in the central drum of this. It was quite a significant undertaking, but it is easier and more accessible than ever before to produce your own ice cream at home. There are lots of other Italian engineers who are making really significant contributions to the development of ice and refrigeration at this time, including registering a number of important patents. The Sicilian Damiano Assanti registered the first ice cream making method in 1853. Giovanni Battista Piatti registered some improvements in the production of ice in 1856, and then in 1862, Giovanni Tiselli registered 2 methods for the freezing, cooling, and making of sweet syrups. I could go on. As the century progresses, there are a lot more. But by the early 20th century, it was more common that ice cream and ice making machines had become detached from their Italian origins, with names like the Imperial Ice Cream Maker or the American Ice Machine becoming much more common for machines like this one. In this, there's a common trend with immigrant foods in England, cooking and technology. Once the novelty of a foreign thing has worn off, it's often adopted and then assimilated into English culture, and it's almost rebranded. Many domestic things have their foreign origins or associations removed as this process moves. We may still associate Italian immigrant communities with ice cream or gelato even today, but the important technological advances that made it possible in the first place, and a great deal more in food technology, are much less commonly associated with an Italian contribution to science and technology. This is one example of many, which gives evidence of a xenophobic desire to erase the foreign from the domestic sphere. There is a constant back and forth between seeking new international innovations and living with the fear of bringing a corrupting foreign influence inside the English home. It's often been argued that Italians were regarded as racially distinct from the English and suffered considerable prejudice as an immigrant community in London. Not only is this linked to their nationality, but also to their religion. Much like their Irish counterparts, and often the French as well at this time, the prevalence of Catholicism in Italian immigrant communities marked them out as an untrustworthy influence on the Anglican or Protestant home. In another area of domestic labour, this is also really common. Governesses responsible for childcare were defined by their nationality, and very often a desire for your child to be taught perfect French came with a real anxiety about exposing them to their tutor's Catholicism. So England's relationship with Catholic Europe had long been complicated at this point, but it's not the only arena in which global influences in English kitchens reveal some of the prejudices of broader society. In the late 19th century, the British Empire was approaching its territorial peak, and its influence on all areas of life in London were at their most pervasive and significant. This map shows an approximation of the British Empire territory around 1890 in red here. I find that as historians of the 19th century, we talk a lot about empire, but we don't actually stop and appreciate the sheer geographical breadth of British imperial territories all that often. So take a look at the map for a minute and really think in particular about the spread of different cuisines that are encompassed in the red territories, the spread of ingredients, of climate, of tastes, of plants and animals that all of this includes. Think about the wildly different foods, foodways, and traditions from these areas, nations, and countries. The variety really is unimaginably huge. And the reason that I've asked you to consider that is this woman and her cookery book. I mentioned earlier that the top 10 foreign food cookery books in 1850s, 1914, Escoffier's Guide to Modern Cookery was the second most popular with its 20-odd editions. The book which beats it in that table with at least 32 editions is Hilda's Where Is It of Recipes by the incredibly named Hildegonda Duckett, and it was first published in 1890. Not only was this book the most popular foreign cookery book by some distance, but it was second only to Beeton's Household Management in popularity overall, despite being published almost 30 years later. She also published a follow-up volume in 1902, The Diary of a Cape Housekeeper, which continued in a similar vein. Now, unlike the French cookery books I spoke about earlier, Duckett was herself a housewife, not a trained cook. Although of English descent, she was born and lived her entire life at the Cape, or the Cape Colony, which was part of the British Empire in modern-day South Africa and Lesotho. Duckett's book is not all about Southern African cuisine, however. It does include Southern African staples such as biltong and confit, but it also talks about Malay curries, Bengali chutneys, Italian cream, Indian kedgeree, Boston puffs, Dutch potteries, and Cape shellfish, to name a few. These recipes draw inspiration from across the British Empire and the Dutch colonies as well, with an occasional European entrant, and they're all presented together in alphabetical order. Many of the recipes are listed with the friends and acquaintances that Duckett received them from, the majority of whom are also white Cape housewives or military men, though many had moved around the empire and they brought some recipes with them. So this homogenous view of food from the empire is a really common thing in English cookery books. Food is either imperial or not, and the distinctions between regions and nations seem to matter very little. Duckett's book does at least point out where some of the recipes are from, and it makes a selling point of its global inspirations, but many don't even do that. And curry in particular is used as an all-encompassing shorthand for non-white food with any level of spice from anywhere in what we now term the global south. Daniel Santiago, however, is an author who bucks this trend. He was originally from Ceylon, or modern-day Sri Lanka, and he's one of very few writers to push back against this homogenization of global foods, writing in The Curry Cook's Assistant in 1889. Santiago's work is a rare example of an indigenous cookbook author writing about their own regional foods for an English audience. He's at pains to explain that curry provides variety, and he explains in detail the difference between Bengali, Bombay, Madras, and Ceylonese dishes and their flavor profiles. But even Santiago's work is moderated to an extent. His foreword is written by John Loudon Shand, his employer in Ceylon and again in the UK, and a colonial tea farmer and merchant. Shand's introduction to Santiago's book is largely complimentary, if quite condescending, and in particular about Santiago's language. He says, Daniel Santiago's English may occasionally provoke a smile, but it is English as she is spoken by several millions of Her Majesty's subjects, and its originality often lends it force. There's a second foreword to Daniel Santiago's book by the imperial and military commentator Alfred Egremont Hake. He again points out Santiago's unusual English, but he hints at some agency in this choice because he claims that Santiago thinks that English ladies and gentlemen like his broken English. These introductions and their othering of Santiago through his language skills are really important, as is Hildegonda Duckett's positioning as an authority on imperial food from around the world, despite having never left the Cape Colony for any significant amount of time. Santiago was an exception to a fairly universal rule that white colonists are the conduit through which Indian, Ceylonese, African, and many other cuisines are introduced to London homes through cookbooks or otherwise. This is another example of this. Despite almost appearing nowhere else in the domestic record, there are significant numbers of military men who appear all of a sudden when it comes to Anglo-imperial foods. Many of these captains, colonels, majors, and generals position themselves as arbiters of authenticity around curry and indigenous foods. And I've chosen this quote here from Cassell's Household Guide, which is a really famous and prolific annual publication on household management. There are very, very few men who write for or appear in Cassell's, so this is quite unusual from the start. And the quote reads, I dined a few days afterwards with an Anglo-Indian, an old general. I ventured to ask how my host could get his cook to make in England a curry so closely resembling those made in India, as I felt certain I detected some of the ingredients therein which are most difficult to procure here. He said laconically, parcel post, adding as a rider that he himself taught his cook how to make curry. And then next, this quote is another example. It's the frontispiece of a pamphlet by Captain White. Captain White's was actually a very widely available curry paste and powder provisioner, so this is an advertising pamphlet. It's branded as Salim's curry paste, but never without Captain White, who seems to be fictional, but provides a lot of reviews of the products. As well as speaking rather fondly of the food they discovered in their imperial postings, the promotion and arbitration of imperial foods by returned military veterans, and in particular the policing of authenticity, reflects the racism of the wider imperial project, and in fact it reinforces it in middle-class English homes. This is a concept which has been much discussed in modern food studies. So for an example, Sarah Kay analysed over 20,000 online reviews of ethnic cuisines in America, and she found that language around authenticity contributes to the proliferation of white supremacist ideas. Kay found that authenticity is in fact damning with faint praise when it comes to food. It enforces America's white supremacist attitudes by aligning food with cheap, dirty, kitschy ideas of what authentic means. And in so doing, it deprives its cooks of the ability to be innovative or creative without risking accusations of not being the real thing if they step outside of a stereotype. And I think this idea maps very clearly onto how curries and other international foods were seen and represented in England in the late 19th century. Not only were they homogenized as one big imperial food category, far less defined than any white European cuisine ever was, but they were also presented largely by white colonizing voices and frequently explicitly military ones. Imperial power structures were being replicated back in the old country. Almost every example of food from within British imperial territories is mediated by whiteness to gain acceptability. So in conclusion, this has been a real canter through some of the global influences on food and cooking in London homes 1850 to 1914. This period was bookended by the Great Exhibition of 1851 and the outbreak of the First World War, and it also saw unprecedented British imperial expansion and huge technological advances. London was undoubtedly a globally connected city in the midst of all this, and lots of academic attention has been paid to that and how it played out on a public, larger scale in the city. But there's been far less attention looking at the complex web of international influences in the ordinary homes of private citizens. So I hope that these few examples have shown that cooking and eating in London during the period was not all grey meat and potatoes. New technologies in the home opened up new possibilities like ice cream making, and a boom in book publishing also led to a boom in cookbooks and domestic advice, offering more culinary choice than ever before through the printed word to many people who may never have travelled. New technologies in this period quite dramatically altered the culinary landscape. However, the proliferation of foreign foods, as you might expect, is complicated, and the story is not always positive. The contributions of immigrants to food in London have been significant, as they are in so many areas, but xenophobia and racism have often led to the downplaying of that contribution. And in the case of foods which came to the capital through empire, that's especially true. The availability of new ingredients and recipes from all over the world was heavily mediated by whiteness, replicating imperial power structures on this domestic scale and consistently othering indigenous cooks from the global south. There are so many more things I could bore on about for hours here. The influence of American preservatives on canning technology, Jewish foods in the city and their influence on British classics, or the small army of international food and drink professionals in Queen Victoria's kitchens. I really could keep you all here for days, but I hope, if nothing else, this talk has left you very keen to head off for dinner and have a good think about how your dinner arrived on your plate. And I just hope that no one is stuck with lamb and potatoes tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was brilliant, kind of fascinating, and you